Our keynote speaker is Mr. Chris Hedges. In his work, he works to speak truth to power. He is a senior fellow at the Nation Institute, and he has spent nearly 2 decades as a foreign correspondent in Central America, the Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans. He was part of the New York Times team that won the 2002 Pulitzer Prize for the paper's coverage of global terrorism and received the 2002 Amnesty International Global War for Human Rights Journalism. He has been a notable commentator on the Occupy movement and the current conditions of our society. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Chris Hedges.
Steven Spielberg had that half hour in the film, we might actually understand the road to freedom. I wrote a book a couple years ago called Death of the Liberal Class. It began as a book on the press. Knopf, big publisher in New York, had come to me and asked me to write the book. It was a good lesson. If there are any writers in the room, and that is never write a book that is someone else's idea. Because when I gave the manuscript to the editors at Knopf, they read it and they hated it. They said they'd publish it after they assigned an editor to excise what they call all the negativity. So I scrambled, of course, to find another publisher to publish it. And in that transition, began to reflect that it wasn't just the press, but the pillars of our liberal establishment which have decayed, if not died. Labor, the Democratic Party, at least as a force, a lesson to defend the interests of writers in the room, that is never write a book that is someone else's idea. Liberal church, which I come out of. Culture, which has become crassly commercialized. And a battle that you are fighting here around public education. And in that reflection about what happened, how did we get here? It took me back to the period right before World War I, where this country had a powerful socialist movement, 70 socialist mayors in the United States, including in major metropolitan cities like Milwaukee and Schenectady, strong, radical labor movements, publications such as Appeal to Reason or The Masses Appeal to Reason, which was a socialist journal, had the 4th highest circulation in the country. And what happened was the war. Wilson had run for re-election in 1912 on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." But with the collapse of the Eastern Front in the battle against Tsarist Russia, there appeared the distinct possibility that the Kaiser could move up to 100 divisions over to the Western Front, defeating the British and the French. And Wall Street, which had lent tremendous sums of money to the British and the French war effort, demanded that Wilson intervene, because if the British and the French were defeated, that money would never be repaid. Now, there was no support for the war, and Wilson knew this. Indeed, after declaring war, it was only a month before they had to institute the draft. And in that period, that debate over how to control the population which did not want intervention in the war, rose a very dark figure in American intellectual history, Walter Lippmann, who argued with Wilson successfully that they would not have to use the coercive measures that Wilson wanted to put in place through the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, but they could create a successful system of mass propaganda that would seduce the masses into the war effort. And Lippmann won that argument, and they created the Committee for Public Information, known as the Creel Commission, because it was headed by a muckraking journalist named George Creel. Now, this system of mass propaganda utilized the understanding of crowd and mass psychology pioneered by Le Bon, Trotter, and of course Sigmund Freud. That people were not moved by fact or reason, but by the skillful manipulation of emotion, what Lippmann calls the capacity to manufacture consent. And when Chomsky and Herman write their book on the media, Manufacturing Consent, that is precisely where they get the phrase from. And so the government creates its own news division, which pumps out daily pro-war news stories. It has its own film division, which makes movies like The Kaiser, The Butcher of Berlin. It has speakers bureaus, which send out speakers all across the country. And when you read those radicals who held fast, Jane Addams, Randolph Bourne, they despair not only about how easily the masses are seduced, but how the intellectual and the radical class is seduced as well. So that those recalcitrant forces that hold back are easily destroyed through the harsher forms of coercion under the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. That is how Eugene V. Debs, the socialist candidate for president, who in 1912 holds 6% of the vote, 900,000 votes, is imprisoned by Wilson. There's a social critic that I like very much, Dwight MacDonald, who says that these radical movements, that the war was the rock on which these radical movements were broken. And after the war, MacDonald says, we entered a period that he calls the psychosis of permanent war. Something none of the political theorists of the 19th century, including Karl Marx, had grappled with. The idea that one was in a permanent state of war against internal and external enemies, and of course, decades later, the iconography and the language has changed, but the mechanism of control in the so-called war on terror is the same. And after the war, the remnants of these radical forces are broken. The Wobblies, the great anarcho-syndicalist unionists, Joe Hill, trumped-up murder charges, hung in Utah. Big Bill Haywood, again, on false murder charges, has to flee the country and spends the last 10 years of his life in exile in Moscow. The deportations of Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, they shut down Appeal to Reason, and they shut down the masses. Appeal to Reason, all publications in the war had to have a pro-war stance. Appeal to Reason had actually adopted one, but it didn't save it. And then, I think, began the unraveling of the American fabric. Chomsky, when he writes about the liberal class, I think understands correctly that the liberal class functions as a safety valve, a way to make incremental and piecemeal reform possible. It responds to pressure. And perhaps the best example of that would be the New Deal, with the collapse of capitalism, and a period in which the traditional liberal class, embodied by Roosevelt and his vice president, Henry Wallace, was able to do what we have been unable to do in this economic crisis, and that is respond rationally to the suffering and grievances of untold numbers of American citizens. And when Conrad Black writes writes his biography of Roosevelt, he says that Roosevelt's greatest achievement is that he saved capitalism. And I think that's right. That without those radical movements and with the decimation of the liberal institutions themselves in the name of anti-communism, we in essence became disempowered. Howard Zinn, I teach in a prison, and unlike if you teach in a college where you try and write a very attractive course description, I have to write a course description that gets through the prison administrators, so it has to look as absolutely banal and boring as possible. And I wrote a course description saying that I wanted to teach the inmates a course on American history and the founding fathers and the process of American democracy. And the moment it was approved, I went out and bought every inmate Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. In New Jersey, prisons are segregated by gang affiliation. These are African-American men, primarily from Camden, Trenton, Bloods. And I was always a huge admirer of Zinn. Never met him, sadly. But boy, teaching that book, I realized what a magnificent intellectual Howard Zinn is, because so many of those inmates had never been taught their own history. And Zinn is very cognizant throughout that book of the African-American experience and the importance of that experience within the American fabric. I give 90-minute talks. You have to raise your hand if you have a question. And I'd be giving talks and I'd hear the inmates go, damn, we've been lied to. But Zinn understood in that book the reality of American history, which is that a white, aristocratic, male, slave-holding class did not want direct or popular democracy. And that they effectively, from the start, created a system by which people were disenfranchised. Native Americans, go back and read what Jefferson or Washington wrote about Native Americans, the enthusiastic embrace of genocide. African Americans, women, people without property, and then, of course, they instituted the Electoral College, which creates the distortion we saw in 2000, where Al Gore earns 500,000 more votes than George W. Bush, and George Bush is appointed president by the Supreme Court. And every opening in American democracy was fought for by these movements. Whether it was the abolitionists, the labor movement, the suffragists who fought for women's rights, and of course, the civil rights movement. Julian Benda, French intellectual, writes a great book in the 1920s called The Treason of Intellectuals, in which he castigates intellectuals for serving systems of power. He says that we have a choice in life between two sets of principles: justice and truth, or privilege and power. And the more we compromise with those who serve the systems of privilege and power, the more we diminish the capacity for justice and truth. And I think this is the great failing that many of us who care about popular democracy and the rights of all Americans have forgotten. That it's not our job to take power. Karl Popper, in The Open Societies and Its Enemies, writes that the question is not how do you get good people to rule. Popper writes, most people attracted to power are at best mediocre. or venal. The question is, how do you make the powerful frightened of you? And certainly until he was killed in 1968, the most powerful political figure in the United States was Dr. Martin Luther King. Because when he went to cities like Selma, or Birmingham, or Memphis, 50,000 people went with him. And the power elite understood very well that the destruction of those movements in the name, at first, of anti-communism, and the disemboweling of liberal institutions was a form of disempowerment. So that by the 1950s, in the House Un-American Activities Committee, we see thousands of high school teachers, social workers. It used to be social workers in this country advocated on behalf of their clients, artists, writers, directors, journalists like I.F. Stone, probably our greatest investigative journalist of the 20th century, becomes a pariah, cannot even get a job at The Nation magazine. And Ellen Schrecker, when she writes in this period, the historian Ellen Schrecker chronicles how these people were removed. The FBI would appear at a high school with a list of names. There would be no evidence given. These teachers would be called in, dismissed, and blackballed. That's how Paul Robeson, his passport seized from him, finally, at the end of his life, is so persecuted that he cannot even sing in an African-American church. The best among us were silenced. And that left us defenseless. So that the capitalist forces that all through the 19th century had kept working men and women in this country in states of desperation and misery essentially began to dismantle what impediments, regulations, and reforms were in place to reconfigure American society, and of course now it's a global phenomenon, into a form of neo-feudalism. We shifted by the early 1970s, in the words of the Harvard historian Charles Bayer, from an empire of production to an empire of consumption. We began to borrow to maintain a level of consumption as well as an empire we could no longer afford. And that gave rise to a kind of faux liberalism, embodied for me in politicians like Bill Clinton, who spoke in that traditional feel-your-pain language of liberalism and yet betrayed the very constituents they purportedly were there to protect. It was Clinton that ran through, in 1994, NAFTA, the greatest betrayal of the working class in this country since the Taft-Hartley Act of 1948, which makes it very difficult to organize. It was Clinton that destroyed the traditional welfare program, and remember, 70% of the recipients of that program were children. It was Clinton that deregulated the FCC, turning media outlets over to the hands of roughly half dozen corporations: Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, Disney, Clear Channel, shrinking political debate to what Freud would call the narcissism of minor difference. It's what Dorothy Parker once said about Katharine Hepburn's emotional range as an actress that goes from A to B. And it was Clinton who destroyed the Glass-Steagall Act, ripped down the firewalls between commercial and investment banks, and precipitated both the national and global economic crisis. Now, the response was that by the 1990s, the Democratic Party had fundraising parity with the Republicans, and in 2008, when the Democratic candidate Barack Obama ran for president, they actually got it. And that left us outside the system, without the movements to pressure the liberal class that functions as a kind of safety valve to protect us, to make incremental and piecemeal reform, and essentially created what we have now, and that is a system of political paralysis. An inability on the part of the formal mechanisms of power to respond rationally to the crisis that has beset the American public. Sheldon Wolin, our greatest living political philosopher, taught at Berkeley and many years at Princeton, in his book, Democracy Incorporated, describes the political system we live under as inverted totalitarianism. And by that he means it's not classical totalitarianism. It doesn't find its expression through a demagogue or a charismatic leader, but through the anonymity of the corporate state. That in classical totalitarian regimes, you have a reactionary or revolutionary force that overthrows a decaying structure and replaces it. In inverted totalitarianism, you have corporate forces that purport to pay fealty to electoral politics, the iconography and language of American patriotism in the Constitution, and yet internally have so subverted the levers of power as to render the citizen impotent. And for me, the example of the political charade that we endure is embodied in one piece of legislation after another, written, of course, by corporate lobbyists. The Affordable Health Care Plan Act was created by the Heritage Foundation. It was first put in place in Massachusetts in 2006 by then Governor Romney. 2,000 pages written by a former executive from the insurance giant Wellfleet for Max Baucus, which includes $447 billion in subsidies for the pharmaceutical and insurance industry, the equivalent of the bank bailout bill for those industries. As anyone who has private insurance plans, as I do, painfully understands, they can ratchet up the premiums at will, as they have. And the first thing they did after it was passed was demand from the White House exemptions, because these insurance companies did not want to insure chronically ill children. Which means in moral terms that we live in a country where it is legally permissible for corporations to hold sick children hostage while their parents bankrupt themselves trying to save their sons or daughters. This is the world corporate forces create. As Karl Marx understood, fettered, unregulated capitalism is a revolutionary force because it commodifies everything. Human beings become commodities, and the natural world becomes a commodity that you then exploit until exhaustion or collapse. And that is why the environmental crisis is intimately twinned with the economic crisis. 40% of the summer Arctic sea ice melts, and Shell and ExxonMobil look at it as a business opportunity. Karl Polanyi, in his book, The Great Transformation, 1944, writes about the nature of unregulated capitalism. He understands that those forces have no limits, that in essence, they will cannibalize themselves until collapse. And that is precisely what is underway. All restraints against corporate power to decimate our communities, the land, the air, the water have been lifted. And the mechanisms of power that once had been able to create some kind of impediments or regulations or checks have been obliterated. And it has left us in a very dangerous and frightening time, as anyone who reads climate science reports knows. It makes Herman Melville and his novel Moby Dick the most prescient study of the American character. We are all aboard the Pequod, and Ahab is the captain. And as Ahab says, my means and my methods are sane. Only my object is mad. 2 years ago, with the great graphic cartoonist Joe Sacco, I set out with him to write about America's sacrifice zones. These places of immense poverty and suffering that went first. Pine Ridge, South Dakota, where the demented project of ceaseless exploitation of land and acts of genocide set the template for imperial expansion to Cuba, the Philippines, today Iraq, Afghanistan. Camden, New Jersey, which per capita is the poorest city in the United States, and not surprisingly, the most dangerous. The coal fields of southern West Virginia, and we flew over the Appalachian Mountains, and it will rip your heart out. Hundreds of thousands of acres destroyed. Gigantic billion-gallon impoundment ponds filled with heavy metals and toxic sludge. The air is fetid. The water is poisoned. We went into some old coal camps in these hollows where everyone who lived in that community had their gallbladders removed. You walk into the nurse's office in the elementary schools, and there are rows of little inhalers for the children. Because the coal companies don't want to dig down for the coal anymore, they just blow the top 400 feet off the mountain. These are the lungs of the Eastern Sea, headwaters for much of the Eastern Sea. Finally, we went to the produce fields in Florida, where the institution of slavery has and continues to exist. As anyone who knows the history of the old turpentine camps and the legacy of Jim Crow understands. There, largely replaced, African American workers have been replaced by undocumented Hispanic workers who also have no legal recourse, no protection. And that is why we periodically uncover camps where people are held behind barbed wire. As African Americans have been in Florida since emancipation. We interviewed a worker who had been held in the back of a truck with other workers for 2 years, chained at night, forced to defecate in the corner of that vehicle until 3 workers punched a hole in the roof, escaped, went to the police, they raided the camp, and the workers in the camp were terrified to testify against their slave holders because their families in Mexico or Honduras or Guatemala had been threatened. They were told those families would be killed. And this worker did testify. And these slave holders were convicted. And he was blacklisted. So that at 4 in the morning, when he went with the other workers in the hopes of having a crew leader pick him so that he could take a bus, sometimes 2 hours out into the tomato fields, he couldn't find a job. And when Joe and I found him, he was sleeping at night under a mango tree and had descended into severe alcoholism. That's the vision of the corporate state. It's a world that replicates the power structure that George Orwell pointed out in 1984 in his fictional country of Oceania, where you have an inner party of 2 to 4%, an outer party of 12, 14%. These are corporate managers, the security and surveillance apparatus, public relations, and 85% are proles. So that now workers here and throughout the world are played one off the other, told that they have to be competitive in a global marketplace, which means being competitive with sweatshop workers in Bangladesh who make 22 cents an hour or prison labor in China. Those forces are not new. I don't need to tell anyone in Memphis that. Those forces are not new. But they have returned. And they seek to subjugate us all. By busying ourselves with a kind of boutique activism about multiculturalism or inclusiveness or gender politics, not that I'm against it, but forgetting the primacy of justice, we turned our back on the working class of this country as they were stripped and destroyed. And what's happened to the working class is now happening to the middle class. The only mechanism we have left is rebuilding those movements and carrying out acts of civil disobedience. Now, these corporations know what's coming. And they are creating, in the same way that Jim Crow created, the same way that the prison industrial complex has created for African Americans. I was just in Alabama. 34% of African American males in Alabama are denied the right to vote because of criminal records. And let's not forget that it was Clinton who also expanded the prison system. So they have put in place legal mechanisms to chain us. FISA Amendment Act, which retroactively makes legal what under our Constitution has traditionally been illegal, the warrantless wiretapping, monitoring, and eavesdropping of tens of millions of American citizens, and we now know that our information is being stored in perpetuity in supercomputers in Utah. Why was it retroactive? Because when Verizon and AT&T and other telecommunications companies gave our personal information to the government after 9/11, they were being challenged in in lower courts, and they knew they would lose. And so they descended on Washington and made sure that when the law was passed, they had retroactive immunity for what they had done. The use of the 2001 Authorization to Use Military Force Act has given the executive branch the right to assassinate American citizens. Anwar al-Awlaki, of course, and his 17-year-old son 2 weeks later, who was on no one's list, terrorist list. The use of the Espionage Act by this administration 6 times to shut down whistleblowers, and we just saw the CIA official Kiriako go to jail, prison for 30 months because they had exposed war crimes. Now, the Espionage Act, which was passed by Wilson in 1917, was our Foreign Secret Act. It was never designed to shut down people who expose crimes committed by the state. It was used 3 times against whistleblowers between 1917 and 2008, the first time being against Daniel Ellsberg. And having worked as an investigative journalist for the New York Times and knowing many who remain in that profession, they will tell you that they cannot get anything internally on the government. People will not even speak to them on background for fear of going to jail. And finally, Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, signed into law a year ago, December 31st, by the President, which permits the U.S. military to seize American citizens who have, quote-unquote, substantially supported, that's not materially supported, that's not a legal term, substantially supported Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or something called associated forces, strip those citizens of due process, hold them in military facilities, including in our offshore penal colonies, indefinitely. And so, a year ago this month, I sued the Defense Secretary and the President in the federal court. And I was joined in that lawsuit by Daniel Ellsberg, Noam Chomsky, and others. And in September of last year, we won. Judge Catherine Forrest in the Southern District of the Court declared that section of the NDAA unconstitutional. And what was the reaction of the Obama administration? We knew they'd appeal. But once that ruling came out, the federal district attorneys disappeared and the attorneys for the Pentagon appeared. And they went to Judge Forrest and demanded an emergency stay, which means put the law back into effect until the appellate court hears the case. And Judge Forrest, to her credit, she wrote a very powerful and moving 112-page opinion that talks about the internment of 110,000 Japanese Americans in World War II and how this law creates the possibility for that to happen again. And so it was a late Friday afternoon, and the Pentagon attorneys went to the appellate court and demanded 9 o'clock on Monday morning an emergency hearing, which they got. And they asked the appellate court for an emergency stay, which they got. Now why? Why did they react that aggressively? Why didn't they just appeal? And there can, in the minds of the lawyers and myself, be only one conclusion, and that is because they are already using the law. Probably against U.S. Pakistani dual nationals in places like Baghdad. And on February 6th, I will be back in court for the oral arguments before the appellate court. And if the appellate court upholds Judge Forrest's ruling, then it will be without question before the Supreme Court in a matter of weeks. The final chapter of this book takes place in Zuccotti Park. The book was always called Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, but revolt, when we began it, was conjecture. And understanding that corporations know only one word, and that's war. That they would push and push and push until there was a backlash. And the Occupy movement arose with that understanding that we have undergone a corporate coup d'etat in slow motion, and if we do not wrest power back from those corporations, we are finished. Everything stems from the malfeasance and criminality of corporate power. Paul Krugman, the New York Times columnist, writes or pleads for a rational response to the economic crisis. Now, a rational response to the economic crisis would include a massive jobs program targeted especially at people under the age of 25, a rational health care program, Medicare for all, a moratorium on foreclosures and bank repossessions, and a forgiveness of student debt. That would be rational. The state did not respond rationally. In a coordinated effort, they shut down the Occupy encampments. And for me, that was a very chilly moment. For it illustrated that the state, the corporate state, had decided that it would speak to us exclusively from now on in the language of force. Political paralysis, as any history student knows, is a very dangerous phenomenon. It's what destroyed Tsarist Russia. It was an obsession of Dostoevsky's, the demons, notes from underground. It's about the failure of liberal institutions to function. And as Dostoevsky says, this thrusts a society into moral nihilism. Weimar Germany. The longer that paralysis continues, the more extremist elements within the society are in power. And we have powerful proto-fascist forces in this country. Speak in the language of hate and violence, celebrate the gun culture, and are using the legitimate rage and sense of betrayal and directing it, as fascist movements do always, against the vulnerable, Muslims, undocumented workers, African Americans, homosexuals, intellectuals, feminists. These people have a long list of people they hate. And because those of us who care about the open society have been seen our movements and our institutions decimated, we stand at a moment in which we must fight, but from a position that is fragile and perhaps even weak. My friend Cornel West and I held in Zuccotti Park in New York a people's hearing of Goldman Sachs. We brought New York City public school teachers who had lost their jobs, mothers who had been foreclosed from their homes to testify. And then we marched on Goldman Sachs. And I want to close by reading this passage on this march from my book. Faces appeared to me. Moments before protesters from Occupy Wall Street and I were arrested on a windy November afternoon in front of Goldman Sachs. They were not the faces of the smug Goldman Sachs employees who peered at us through revolving doors and lobby windows, a pathetic collection of middle-aged fraternity and sorority members. They were not the faces of the blue uniformed police with their dangling plastic handcuffs, or the thuggish Goldman Sachs security personnel whose buzz cuts and dead eyes reminded me of the Stasi. They were not the faces of the demonstrators around me, the ones with massive student debts and no jobs, the ones weighed down by their broken dreams, the ones whose anger and betrayal triggered the street demonstrations and occupations for justice. They were not the faces of the onlookers, the construction workers who seemed cheered by the march on Goldman Sachs, or the suited businessmen who did not. They were faraway faces. They were the faces of children dying. They were tiny, confused, bewildered faces I had seen in the southern Sudan, Gaza, the slums of Brazzaville, Nairobi, Cairo, Delhi, in the wars I covered. They were faces with large, glassy eyes above bloated bellies. They were the small faces of children convulsed by the ravages of starvation and disease. I carry these faces. They do not leave me. I look at my own children and cannot forget them, these other children who never had a chance. War brings with it a host of horrors, but the worst is always the human detritus that war and famine leave behind. The small, frail bodies whose tangled limbs and vacant eyes condemn us all. The wealthy and the powerful, the ones behind the glass at Goldman Sachs, laughed and snapped pictures of us as if we were an odd lunchtime diversion from commodities trading, from hoarding and profit, from the collective sickness of money worship, as if we were creatures in a cage, which in fact we soon were. Goldman Sachs Commodities Index is the most heavily traded in the world. The financial firm hoards futures of rice, wheat, corn, sugar, and livestock, and jacks up commodity prices by as much as 200% on the global market, so that poor families can no longer afford basic staples and literally starve. Hundreds of millions of poor in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America do not have enough to eat in order to feed this mania for profit. The technical jargon, learned in business schools and on trading floors, effectively masks the reality of what is happening: murder. The cold, neutral words of business and commerce are designed to make systems operate, even systems of death, with a ruthless efficiency. The people behind the windows and those of us with arms locked in a circle on the concrete outside did not speak the same language. Profit, trade, speculation, globalization, war, national security. These are the words they use to justify the snuffing out of tiny lives, acts of radical evil. The glass tower before us is filled with people carefully selected for the polish and self-assurance that come with having been formed in institutions of privilege. Their primary attributes are a lack of consciousness, a penchant for deception, aggressiveness, a worship of money, and an incapacity for empathy or remorse. It is always the respectable classes, the polished Ivy League graduates, the prep school boys and girls who grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, or Short Hills, New Jersey, who are the most susceptible to evil. To be intelligent, as many are at least in a narrow analytical way, is morally neutral. These respectable citizens are inculcated in their elitist ghettos with values and norms, including pious acts of charity used to justify their privilege, and a belief in the innate goodness of American power. They are trained to pay deference to systems of authority. They are taught to believe in their own goodness, unable to see or comprehend, and are perhaps indifferent to the cruelty inflicted on others by the exclusive systems they serve. And as norms change, as the world is steadily transformed by corporate forces into a small cobble of predators and a vast herd of human prey, these elites seamlessly replace one set of values with another. These elites obey the rules, they make the system work, and they are rewarded for this. In return, they do not question. We seem to have lost, at least until the advent of the Occupy Wall Street movement, not only all personal responsibility, but all capacity for personal judgment. Corporate culture absolves all of responsibility. This is part of its appeal. It relieves all from moral choice. There is an unequivocal acceptance of principles such as unregulated capitalism and globalization as a kind of natural law. The steady march of corporate capitalism requires a passive acceptance of new laws and demolished regulations, of bailouts in the trillions of dollars, and the systematic looting of public funds, of lies and deceit. The corporate culture epitomized by Goldman Sachs has seeped into our classrooms, our newsrooms, our entertainment systems, and our consciousness. This corporate culture has stripped us of the right to express ourselves outside of the narrow confines of the established political order. We are forced to surrender our voice. Corporate culture serves a faceless system. It is, as Hannah Arendt wrote, the rule of nobody, and for this very reason, perhaps the least human and most cruel form of rulership. Those who resist, the doubters, outcasts, artists, renegades, skeptics, and rebels rarely come from the elite. They ask different questions. They seek something else, a life of meaning. They have grasped Immanuel Kant's dictum: if justice perishes, human life on earth has lost its meaning. And in their search, they come to the conclusion that, as Socrates said, it is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong. This conclusion makes a leap into the moral. It refuses to place a monetary value on human life. It acknowledges human life, indeed all life, as sacred. And this is why, as Arendt points out, the only morally reliable people are not those who say this is wrong, or this should not be done, but those who say, I can't. The greatest evildoers are those who don't remember, because they have never given thought to the matter, and without remembrance, nothing can hold them back, Arendt wrote. For human beings, thinking of past matters means moving in the dimension of depth, striking roots, and thus stabilizing ourselves so as not to be swept away by whatever may occur, the zeitgeist or history or simple temptation. The greatest evil is not radical. It has no roots. And because it has no roots, it has no limitations. It can go to unthinkable extremes and sweep over the whole world. There are streaks in my lungs, traces of the tuberculosis I picked up around hundreds of dying Sudanese during the famine I covered as a foreign correspondent. I was strong and privileged and fought off the disease. They were not, and did not. bodies, most of them children, were dumped into hastily dug mass graves. The scars I carry within me are the whispers of these dead. They are the faint marks of those who never had a chance to become men or women, to fall in love and have children of their own. I carried these scars to the doors of Goldman Sachs. I placed myself at the feet of these commodity traders to call for justice, because the dead and those dying in slums and refugee camps across the planet could not make the journey. I see their faces. They haunt me in the day and come to me in the dark. They force me to remember, and they make me choose sides. Thank you.
We're closing tonight, and first I just need to let everyone know that Chris is signing books after tonight's talk. He'll be in the back. We have a limited number of books for sale, so please, no rush to the back. But if we could, make our way orderly back there in a few minutes. But as we've just heard, though tonight is about celebration, it's about a call to action. A call to action that we all take, because we've all got those streaks somewhere in our lives. For me, those streaks are seen in my children, and the way that I work every day to make sure that this world that I live is not the same when they're my age. For you, those streaks may be something different, but no matter what they are, realizing that we have them is one thing, but realizing that we have the power to take those to the seats of power in our country and make a difference is something that is completely different. So while words are inspiring, this night is about movement. So please, while many of you join us already, the rest of you join us tomorrow. Because this movement is ongoing, and it's not about me, it's not about these amazing staff people that I've told you about, it's not about our great sponsors or the other organizations that are in this room, it's about you, each and every one of you, taking that personal witness that you have to those seats of power and demanding no more. Now, one of the favorite chants for me from Occupy was, and I'm blanking out on it now. I had it just a second. It was, "We are unstoppable. Another world is possible." And we are. So go forth tonight knowing that you are unstoppable. And knowing that throughout your community there are people that are ready to be unstoppable with you. Let's join together. Let's not stop.